Welcome to my channel. Today we delve into a chilling true story that began with a calm and ordinary flight, a blue sky morning where everything seemed safe, steady, and routine until a deafening blast shattered the cockpit, and the captain was ripped halfway out of the aircraft at 17,000 feet. This isn't just a story of disaster. It's a story of defiance, teamwork, and raw human will to survive. This is the terrifying day when a routine flight became a desperate midair battle for life, the day the crew refused to let go. It started like countless flights before it. The aircraft rolled smoothly down the runway of Birmingham Airport, the engines roaring with the steady rhythm passengers trust without thinking. For many on board, it was just another flight across the UK, a short, familiar route, a plane they'd flown many times before. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer were relaxed but professional, trading quiet words, running through their checklists. The air was smooth, the weather clear, and the crew expected nothing more than a straightforward journey. But in the silent, invisible spaces between the metal rivets on the fuselage, a hidden danger had been waiting. A tiny, almost imperceptible flaw that no one had noticed. A single weakness in the cockpit windshield that would soon explode into chaos. As the plane climbed toward 17,000 feet, everything still felt normal. Flight attendants moved down the aisles with easy smiles, handing out drinks, checking belts. Passengers settled into their seats, some reading, some chatting softly, some staring absently out the windows at the morning sky. In the cockpit, the captain leaned slightly forward as he adjusted a control, the light from the windshield spilling across his uniform. The view outside was calm, endless blue. And then, in a single, violent heartbeat, the world exploded. A sound like a shotgun blast tore through the flight deck. The windshield in front of the captain shattered outward with a force no one could have prepared for. Instantly, a hurricane of wind filled the cockpit, howling like a beast. Papers, charts, anything not bolted down was ripped from their places and hurled into the air. The captain didn't even have time to scream before the pressure difference between the cabin and the outside atmosphere sucked him forward. The upper half of his body was dragged through the hole where the cockpit windshield had been a second before. Only his legs remained inside, tangled against the seat, as the freezing air screamed around him. The co-pilot's world narrowed to a single horrifying sight, the captain's body flailing outside the aircraft, his shirt and headset whipping violently in the wind, his face pale against the sky. The roar of rushing air drowned out everything, turning the cockpit into chaos. He didn't have time to think. Training slammed into instinct. He grabbed the captain's belt, but the force was so strong it nearly pulled him from his own seat. His knuckles turned white. The captain's body was limp, his arms flailing as the slipstream tried to claim him completely. Behind the cockpit door, the flight attendants felt the blast too. The cabin pressure plummeted. Masks dropped from the ceiling as passengers gasped at the sudden, violent rush of cold air. The plane jolted as the co-pilot fought to keep control. In seconds, what had been a peaceful flight turned into something out of a nightmare. The first officer forced himself to focus. The autopilot had disengaged with the windshield's destruction, alarms blaring, lights flashing across the panel. His captain, the man beside him moments ago, was hanging outside the plane at 17,000 feet. The wind roared so loudly it felt like the sky itself was screaming. He grabbed the radio, shouting for an emergency descent, his voice nearly lost in the chaos. Air traffic controllers heard only fragments at first, the broken pieces of a desperate cry for help. Mayday, Captain, blown out, emergency descent. In the cabin, oxygen masks dangled in the faces of terrified passengers. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with the kind of calm that only training could give, but even they were shaking. They had no idea what had happened at the front, only that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. People clutched their seats, some praying, some frozen in shock as the aircraft dipped downward in a controlled but rapid descent to breathable altitude. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the fight was not just for control of the plane, but for a man's life. The co-pilot couldn't hold the captain alone. The wind clawed at his body like a living thing, pulling, dragging, trying to rip the captain the rest of the way out. He screamed for help, and within moments, the flight attendants forced the cockpit door open against the pressure and chaos. One of them crawled forward, grabbed the captain's legs, and held on as if their life depended on it, because it did. The captain's body was stiff, his face turning blue in the freezing slipstream. He wasn't moving, but they didn't let go. Down in the control tower, controllers stared at their radar, hearing the broken, fragmented Mayday calls, piecing together the unthinkable. A captain sucked halfway out of a plane. A co-pilot flying blind through wind and noise. A rapid descent. They cleared every plane in the sky, giving them priority, guiding the first officer down with calm, clipped instructions. But inside the cockpit, it was anything but calm. Every inch of the descent was a battle. The co-pilot's headset barely clung to his ears, papers flew like confetti, and ice formed at the edges of the shattered windshield. The pressure drop had triggered alarms throughout the plane, but the crew didn't have time to explain anything. All they could do was act. The first officer steadied the controls with one hand and clutched the captain's belt with the other, but his strength was fading. The flight attendant holding the captain's legs screamed over the wind, "I've got him." Another crew member wrapped their arms around her waist to anchor them both to the floor. In that cockpit, it wasn't just a job anymore. It was pure human determination. The descent continued, the ground creeping closer, air traffic control talking them through vectors, headings, altitude calls. The co-pilot fought every second against the forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. The captain's body slammed against the fuselage, the wind cutting his skin, his face still pale and unresponsive. But they refused to let go. 1 inch, 1 second at a time, they kept him there. Passengers in the cabin didn't know the details. All they knew was that their plane had dropped from the sky and the faces of the flight attendants had gone pale. Some whispered prayers. Others stared at their hands. A mother held her child's head against her chest. A businessman who had never prayed before whispered into his oxygen mask. The first officer's voice cracked as he spoke to the tower again. "We have a captain partially outside the aircraft, windshield failure, emergency landing required." The controller's voice came back steady and calm, as if trying to hold the sky itself still. "You are cleared for immediate landing. Runway is yours." The approach was a blur. The shattered cockpit made it feel like flying through a hurricane. The noise was relentless. The wind clawed at every inch of the flight deck. And through it all, the co-pilot held on to the controls with a grip forged in terror and training. He lined the aircraft up with the runway, the flight attendants still holding onto their captain's lifeless body like anchors against a storm. The landing was brutal. The wheels slammed against the runway, the plane skidded, bounced once, then steadied. Inside the cabin, people screamed, cried, prayed. And then, they felt it. The aircraft slowed. The roaring descent turned into the shudder of wheels on asphalt. They had made it down. Emergency crews raced toward the jet, surrounding it in seconds. Medics climbed aboard as passengers were evacuated. And in the cockpit, with frozen hands and exhausted arms, the crew finally pulled the captain's limp body back inside. He wasn't moving, but the paramedics worked fast. In that moment, the cockpit fell silent except for the sound of breathing, ragged, shaking, human breathing. Against every odd, the captain survived. Broken bones, frostbite, severe shock, but alive. The crew's refusal to let go had kept him tethered to life when everything else tried to rip him away. Investigators later discovered the cause: a replacement windshield installed with the wrong bolts, too small to handle the pressure at altitude. It was a small oversight that nearly cost a man his life and could have brought down an entire plane. That day became a story told around the world, not just of failure, but of courage. A co-pilot who flew through a hurricane of wind with one hand on the controls and the other gripping his captain's life. Flight attendants who didn't hesitate, who locked arms and held on no matter what. passengers who held their breath as their plane became a storm. It was a story not just of aviation but of the human spirit. And even years later, when pilots tell the story of the British Airways Flight 5390, they don't just talk about the windshield. They talk about the crew, the refusal to let go, the moment when teamwork stood stronger than the wind itself. If you've stayed with me through this powerful story, thank you. These stories remind us how fragile and extraordinary life can be. If you want to hear more real, gripping survival stories from the skies, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and together we'll keep their courage alive. The first thing anyone noticed wasn't the sound of screaming, it was the bang. A sharp, violent crack like a cannon going off, followed by the sudden roar of wind that filled the cockpit like a hurricane. One moment, everything on British Airways Flight 5390 was calm, steady and routine, and the next, it was as if the sky itself had ripped open. At 17,000 feet, with no warning, the windshield in front of the captain's seat exploded outward into the freezing, thin air. The blast ripped through the silence, tearing papers from clipboards, yanking headsets from ears, and throwing the flight deck into chaos. The captain didn't even have time to react before the suction hit him like a physical blow. 1 second, he was seated at the controls. The next, half his body was outside the plane. The pressure difference between the cabin and the outside air was instant and merciless. The entire front of the cockpit became a violent wind tunnel. The captain's body was yanked forward with a force so intense that his feet barely caught on the yoke, keeping him from being fully sucked out. The wind screamed through the hole where the windshield used to be, ice-cold and deafening, like standing in the middle of a storm with no shelter. The co-pilot's world narrowed to a single terrifying image. His captain, pinned against the outside of the aircraft, his shirt whipping violently, his body frozen stiff in the howling air. His face was pale, eyes shut, his headset gone. He looked dead already. The co-pilot lunged forward without thinking, reaching for the captain's belt and grabbing it with both hands. The suction nearly ripped him out of his seat too. He screamed into the radio for help, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. The air rushing through the cockpit was so loud it drowned out everything, a continuous roar that filled every inch of space. He couldn't even hear himself think. His hands slipped once, but he caught the captain again, locking his arms around the belt, straining every muscle in his body to keep the captain from being pulled fully out into the sky. In the cabin, passengers didn't yet know what had happened. They heard the bang too, felt the violent shift in air pressure, and then saw the oxygen masks fall from the ceiling like pale ghosts. A few screamed. Others fumbled for the masks with shaking hands. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, their training kicking in even as fear tightened in their throat. The plane shuddered as the co-pilot began an emergency descent, trying to get the aircraft to a breathable altitude before anyone passed out from the thin air. In the cockpit, the co-pilot's chest was burning. He couldn't hold on much longer. The wind ripped through his hair, stung his eyes, made it nearly impossible to breathe. The captain's body was stiff, his skin turning an unnatural shade from the freezing air. It was hard to tell if he was alive or already gone. The co-pilot yelled for help, but his voice barely carried over the storm. Then the cockpit door flew open, pushed by the change in pressure, and a flight attendant crawled in, fighting against the wind like a soldier against a current. She saw the captain's body immediately. His legs inside, his torso and head outside, his arms flailing weakly in the wind, and didn't hesitate. She grabbed one of his legs with both hands, bracing her feet against the base of the cockpit wall. The co-pilot screamed for another crew member. Within seconds, a second attendant appeared, dropping to the floor, wrapping her arms around the first to anchor her. They formed a human chain against the storm. The cockpit itself felt like it was disintegrating. The papers and checklists that normally sat neatly clipped to the control panels were gone, flung out into the sky. Anything that wasn't bolted down had already disappeared. The wind tore at the pilots' faces, the instruments flickering under the strain of the decompression. The co-pilot somehow managed to grab the yoke with one hand, holding on to the captain's belt with the other. Every second stretched like an eternity. The cold bit at their skin. The captain's shirt snapped and flapped violently, his hair whipped by the wind, his body hanging there like a flag caught in a storm. In the cabin, people clung to their seats as the aircraft began its emergency descent. The sudden drop pressed them into their seatbelts, ears popping from the change in pressure. Oxygen masks hung over pale faces. Some passengers prayed quietly. Others sat frozen, staring at the ceiling, at the masks, at nothing. A mother wrapped her arms around her little girl and whispered that everything would be okay, even though her own hands were shaking. Back in the cockpit, the co-pilot forced his voice through the roaring wind, yelling into the radio for air traffic control. Only fragments made it through. Mayday, Captain, out, windshield failure, emergency descent. Controllers in the tower stared at their screens, confused at first, then horrified as the words pieced themselves together. A captain sucked halfway out of a plane. No one had ever trained for that. The aircraft continued to drop, the co-pilot fighting the controls with one hand. Every second, he expected to lose his grip. His arms burned. The captain's belt was cutting into his palms. But then something inside him hardened. He wasn't letting go. No matter what happened, no matter how hard the wind tried to rip the man away, he would not let go. The flight attendant holding the captain's legs screamed over the noise, "He's still warm." The second attendant wrapped tighter around her waist, becoming an anchor as the captain's body jerked violently with every shift of the aircraft. The co-pilot's breathing was ragged. He had to keep the plane steady. He had to keep the man alive. And he had to bring 200 people down safely. The workload was impossible. But somehow, through a fog of adrenaline and terror, he kept going. His voice over the radio became clearer as the aircraft descended to a lower altitude. Air traffic control gave him priority clearance to land. Every other aircraft in the area was diverted. The sky belonged to him now. The captain was motionless, but the crew refused to believe he was gone. They tightened their grip around his legs, braced their backs against the walls, using their bodies as human restraint. The cold air knifed through the cockpit. Their arms went numb. But they didn't loosen their hold. Not once. In the cabin, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Some passengers sobbed quietly. Others held hands. They could feel the plane's controlled but rapid descent, the way it vibrated under the strain. The flight attendants who remained in the cabin moved with steel in their voices, repeating instructions, reminding everyone to stay calm. But their faces said what their voices didn't. Something terrible had happened at the front of the plane. The co-pilot lowered the aircraft steadily toward Southampton Airport, the closest safe landing site. He checked instruments with quick glances, adjusted the flaps, worked the radios, all while still holding the captain's belt with the strength of a man running on pure adrenaline. The wind howled around them. The cracked frame of the missing windshield groaned. The captain's body shifted slightly in the slipstream, but the attendants tightened their grip until their fingers went numb. And in that violent, freezing, deafening storm, a quiet, unspoken vow held the cockpit together: they would not let him go. Even if their arms gave out. Even if the storm tore at them. Even if the sky itself wanted to take him. The emergency landing was still far away. The plane was still bleeding speed, still screaming through the cold air. But the crew had made their choice. Whatever happened next, they were in this together. And that refusal, to surrender, to let go, to give in, was the only thing standing between life and tragedy. The roar of the wind had become more than just noise now. It was a living, howling force pounding against every surface of the cockpit, hammering its way through metal, glass, and bone. British Airways Flight 5390 was hurtling forward through the sky at 17,000 feet, and half of its captain was still hanging outside the shattered windshield. The co-pilot's muscles burned as if they were on fire, every vein in his arms straining to keep a grip on the captain's belt while still flying a plane that was fighting him at every second. His headset barely clung to his head. His breath was short and ragged, ripped away by the icy wind that tore through the cockpit. He wasn't just flying anymore. He was fighting. The flight attendants who had crawled into the cockpit were now part of a human chain, their arms wrapped around each other and around the captain's legs, faces twisted in concentration and fear. The air was so cold it felt like knives cutting through their skin. Their hair whipped wildly around their faces, their ears numb, their fingertips already losing feeling. But still, they held on. The captain's body flailed in the wind, his shirt plastered to his chest, his face chalk-white and unresponsive. It was hard to tell if he was alive. His head was tilted back, slamming against the fuselage with every shift of turbulence, and the wind howled so loud it drowned out everything else. In the cabin, the situation was unraveling in a different way. The decompression had dropped oxygen masks across every seat. People had grabbed them with shaking hands, some crying, some whispering prayers, some too frozen in shock to move at all. The air inside the cabin was sharp and thin. Children clung to their parents. Flight attendants in the cabin kept their voices firm, instructing passengers to stay seated and remain calm. But even the calmest faces were pale. They all felt the sudden descent. They all knew something terrible had happened up front. The co-pilot forced his trembling hand onto the yoke, trying to keep the aircraft steady. His other hand still clutched the captain's belt with a grip that felt like it was tearing his muscles apart. The alarms had blared themselves hoarse, red and amber lights flashing across the flight deck. The autopilot was gone. It was all manual now, flying blind through a storm of noise and wind. He leaned into the controls, fighting the drag from the broken windshield, fighting to bring the aircraft down to a safer altitude. If he didn't, everyone, including the man dangling outside the plane, would lose consciousness. Down in the control tower, the fragmented Mayday call that had burst through their radios moments ago was now clearer. The co-pilot's voice, strained and shaking, reached them in broken bursts between the wind tearing through the mic. Mayday windshield, captain's out, emergency descent, request priority. The controller froze for just a moment. A captain outside the aircraft? It sounded impossible, but the urgency in that voice left no room for doubt. Within seconds, the controller cleared the airspace, rerouted other aircraft, and gave the co-pilot an immediate descent path. Every second now was measured against gravity itself. In the cockpit, the co-pilot focused through the chaos. His eyes stung from the wind, but he kept scanning the instruments, cross-checking altitude, speed, and descent angle. They were dropping fast, but he needed to keep it controlled. If the descent became too steep, the airflow around the captain's body could shift, and they could lose him completely. If it was too shallow, they'd run out of oxygen before they got low enough. Every choice was a razor-thin line between survival and disaster. The flight attendants clung to the captain's legs with everything they had. The lead attendant had her arms locked around his knees, teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. Her colleague held her around the waist, digging her heels into the floor as if she could anchor herself to the plane itself. The third attendant had wrapped a belt around one of the cockpit fixtures, securing their chain against the pull of the wind. The captain's shoes were nearly ripped off, his uniform snapping against the air like fabric in a storm. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But his pulse, faint and freezing, was still there. And that was enough. The co-pilot adjusted their course toward Southampton Airport, the closest suitable landing site. His mind was splitting between the controls, the emergency checklists he barely had time to glance at, and the desperate fight happening just feet away from him. He wanted to scream for someone to help. But there was no one else. It was him, the crew, and the wind. In the cabin, fear was spreading like a silent wave. A woman clutched the crucifix around her neck, whispering over and over. A man in the back row had tears running down his face but sat completely still, frozen in his seat. A child asked his mother if the plane was breaking, and the mother, voice cracking, whispered, "No," even though her eyes said something else. The flight attendants at the back kept moving, kept speaking in calm, trained voices, but they were shaking too. Back in the cockpit, a moment of turbulence slammed the plane. The captain's body jerked violently against the fuselage, his arms flailing in the slipstream. The lead flight attendant screamed, tightening her grip, nearly losing her hold for a fraction of a second before locking her arms around his legs again. The co-pilot shouted over the noise, "Hold him!" though he knew they were already giving everything they had. His own hand slipped on the belt, sweat slick against the freezing leather, but he refused to let go. At 11,000 feet, the pressure in the cabin began to stabilize enough for passengers to breathe without their masks. But the scene in the cockpit hadn't gotten any calmer. The wind still howled through the broken windshield, the instruments still rattled, and the captain still dangled lifelessly outside the plane. The co-pilot could feel his muscles going numb, but he forced his mind to stay razor-sharp. He radioed the tower again, voice steadier now, telling them they were preparing for an emergency landing. The controller's voice came back calm, quiet, trying to be an anchor in the storm. "You're clear for immediate landing. All runways open. Fire and rescue standing by." The flight attendants were exhausted. Their arms shook uncontrollably. Their faces were red from the cold. One of them had blood on her hands from where the captain's belt had cut into her skin, but she didn't loosen her grip. The lead attendant leaned her forehead against his legs for a second, just to steady her breathing, then locked her arms again. In that cockpit, it wasn't about training anymore. It was pure human will. The co-pilot reached up and adjusted the throttles, the flaps, preparing for the approach. He couldn't even wipe the sweat and windburn from his face. The captain's legs twitched slightly in the wind, and for the first time since the blast, the attendant closest to him shouted, "He's moving." Hope cut through the storm like a thin beam of light. He wasn't gone. He was still there. That gave them all a surge of strength they didn't know they had. As the aircraft descended lower, the noise didn't fade, but their focus sharpened. They were close now. The co-pilot's hands were steady despite the ache in his arms. The attendants were still locked in their desperate hold. The passengers clung to their seat. And the control tower waited, every eye fixed on the radar. What began as a routine flight had turned into a battle between wind, steel, and sheer human determination. The crew wasn't letting go. Not now. Not ever. And below them, the runway was getting closer. The descent was no longer just a flight, it was a war against the sky itself. British Airways Flight 5390 plunged through the cold air toward Southampton Airport, its nose pointed toward the runway like an arrow cutting through the storm. The cockpit had become a wind tunnel, a roaring, screaming void of pressure and ice, tearing at every loose edge, at every inch of human strength still holding the captain in place. The co-pilot's face was red from the cold, his lips cracked and bleeding, but he didn't let go of the controls. His right hand gripped the yoke with the kind of desperation that lives between instinct and duty, and his left hand, raw from the strain, still clutched the captain's belt, refusing to surrender him to the sky. The flight attendants in the cockpit were exhausted, their arms and legs cramping from holding their positions for so long. Their hair whipped around their faces, their fingers stiff and pale from the freezing slipstream. But they stayed locked in place, forming that unbreakable human chain on the floor. The lead attendant had blood streaking down her knuckles from where the metal belt buckle had torn into her skin, but she didn't loosen her grip. Her colleague behind her was shaking, not from fear anymore but from the cold seeping into their bones. And yet, through that chaos, they shared silent eye contact with the co-pilot, a mutual, wordless vow that none of them would let go. Outside the shattered windshield, the ground was getting closer. Runway lights, faint pinpricks in the gray horizon, were growing larger, clearer, sharper. They looked like salvation, but to the crew they also looked like the edge of everything they had fought for since the blast ripped through the cockpit. The co-pilot forced himself to steady his breathing, though each inhale burned his throat from the icy air. He checked the speed, checked the descent rate, checked the alignment again and again, each movement slow and precise. Any mistake now wouldn't just cost them the captain. It would cost everyone on board. The captain's body jerked violently in the wind as the aircraft hit a small pocket of turbulence, slamming his head against the side of the fuselage with a dull, sickening sound that made the attendants flinch. One of them screamed his name out of pure reflex, though she knew he couldn't hear her through the storm. The co-pilot tightened his grip around the belt instinctively, pulling with everything he had. For a fraction of a second, he thought the captain would be torn away. But the chain held. They held. In the cabin, passengers had fallen into a thick, terrified silence. The initial panic and chaos had melted into something heavier, colder. People weren't screaming anymore. They were listening. Listening to the strange sound of wind leaking through the cracks of the aircraft. Listening to the engines straining. Listening to the sound of a plane being flown not by two pilots, but by one man fighting a storm and death itself. A woman sat with her hands folded in prayer, tears streaking down her cheeks. A young boy stared at the seat back in front of him, frozen, gripping his mother's sleeve so hard she could feel the shape of his fingers through the fabric. The control tower's voice crackled faintly through the headset that was barely clinging to the co-pilot's head. "You are clear for immediate landing. Rescue services are standing by." Calm, level, professional. But beneath the calm words, the tower controller knew exactly what kind of landing this was. They had heard the Mayday. They knew what waited in that cockpit. They just couldn't help him. No one could now. The co-pilot adjusted the flaps manually, one at a time, feeling the sluggish response of the aircraft against the icy air. The drag from the broken windshield had changed everything. The 737 wasn't handling like a normal aircraft anymore. It felt heavier, like it was fighting him with every inch of its structure. His arms ached. His chest ached. His heart hammered like it was trying to punch through his ribs. He pushed forward anyway. The runway lights filled the shattered frame of the windshield now. The angle was perfect. The speed was barely under control. And behind him, the captain hung like a flag caught in a storm. The lead flight attendant leaned her forehead against his legs for a moment, whispering, "Hold on, just a little longer." She didn't know if he could hear. But saying it made her believe it. The last miles of descent felt like a lifetime. Every vibration, every gust of air felt personal, like the sky itself was trying to tear the aircraft apart in the final stretch. The passengers gripped their seats, flight attendants in the cabin stood braced in their jump seats, and in the cockpit, 3 people held on to one man with everything they had left. Then the co-pilot saw it. The numbers on the altimeter falling. The crisp edges of the runway coming into view. The green lights at the threshold flashing like a heartbeat. He lined up the nose perfectly, his knuckles so white it looked like they might split open. This was it. No go-around. No second try. One landing. One chance. The co-pilot whispered, just loud enough for himself to hear, "Come on, stay with me." He pushed the nose slightly down, guiding the aircraft into the flare. The engines were at idle, the wind screamed, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The wheels hit the runway hard, bouncing once, twice, before digging into the asphalt. The impact slammed through the cabin, jolting passengers forward against their belts, gasps and cries filling the air. Oxygen masks swung violently above their heads. But the co-pilot didn't let the aircraft drift. He kept it straight, using every ounce of strength left in him to keep the plane aligned down the centerline. In the cockpit, the impact almost ripped the captain free. The flight attendant screamed as his body jerked forward violently. But the chain held again. They held again. Sparks burst under the landing gear, the rumble of tires filled the air, and the plane sped down the runway in a blur of sound and wind. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't pretty. But it was alive. The co-pilot engaged the air brakes, the aircraft began to decelerate, and the roar of the wind finally began to lose its grip on them. Slowly, painfully, the speed bled away. The attendants still clung to the captain, as if letting go would undo everything. The co-pilot's chest rose and fell in short, sharp breaths as he pulled the plane to a stop. When the aircraft finally slowed to a crawl and the roar of the slipstream faded, the cockpit fell into a strange, broken silence. The only sounds left were the rasping breaths of the crew and the faint whimpers of passengers behind the door. The world outside was still moving. Emergency vehicles were already rushing toward the aircraft, but inside, the cockpit belonged to them and to the man they refused to let go. The co-pilot slowly released his grip on the yoke, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His other hand was still wrapped around the captain's belt, stiff from holding it for so long that his fingers barely responded when he tried to open them. He finally turned his head toward the captain, the attendants still gripping him like they were holding up the sky, and whispered hoarsely, "We made it." They didn't know yet what condition he was in. They didn't know what the next few minutes would hold. But they had fought the sky itself, and landed. The aircraft screeched down the runway, the wheels screaming against the wet asphalt as the weight of the plane finally touched solid ground. For a moment, it didn't even feel real. The cockpit, once a deafening storm of freezing wind and chaos, was still being torn apart by the slipstream, but the ground was there beneath them now, a fragile, precious barrier between them and disaster. British Airways Flight 5390 had survived the impossible descent, but the fight was not over. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot's hands were still frozen in place, muscles locked in a death grip on the yoke and the captain's belt. His entire body trembled, his lungs burning from hours of breathing icy air, his mind screaming for rest, but he forced himself to stay focused. He couldn't relax. Not yet. The attendants on the floor of the cockpit were no longer fighting the pull of the sky, but their arms were locked so tightly around the captain's legs that they couldn't even unclench their fingers. The lead attendant had bruises forming on her forearms and blood streaking the sides of her hands from where the belt buckle had dug into her skin. Her colleague's eyes were red and glassy, her lips blue from the cold, but both of them were still locked in that same desperate hold that had kept him from being torn away. They looked like soldiers who had just fought through a war. Outside the shattered windshield, the runway lights streaked past in glowing white lines as the plane slowed, the engines howling in reverse thrust. Sparks still flickered beneath the landing gear. The emergency vehicles waiting at Southampton Airport roared into motion, racing toward the crippled aircraft. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue teams moved like a wave of red and white lights, engines growling, knowing they were about to face a situation none of them would ever forget. In the cabin, the initial impact had shaken passengers to their core. People clung to their seatbelts, knuckles white, some crying openly now, not from fear but from the overwhelming realization that they might actually live. A little boy in the back let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. An older man wiped his eyes with shaking hands. A woman whispered, we're down," over and over again as if repeating it would make it more real. The air was heavy with the sound of breath, raw, unsteady, relieved. Back in the cockpit, the co-pilot brought the aircraft to a shuddering stop at the far end of the runway. His hands shook so violently now that he could barely operate the throttles, but somehow, he taxied the aircraft to a safe position where the emergency vehicles could reach them. The wind still screamed through the open hole where the windshield had once been, but it no longer felt like it was winning. For the first time since the blast, the storm didn't control them. They had taken back control. The moment the aircraft came to a complete stop, the cockpit filled with the sound of approaching sirens. The co-pilot's headset buzzed with the calm but urgent voice of the tower. Rescue units on scene. Stand by. He wanted to answer, but his throat was raw and his lips were numb. His only response was a shaky nod that no one could see. Then, something even more terrifying happened. The adrenaline began to wear off. The co-pilot felt his hands loosen, not out of choice but because his body simply couldn't hold on anymore. His fingers felt like wood, stiff and burning. He slumped back slightly in his seat, the weight of everything he had held together crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Behind him, the flight attendants were doing the same. Their arms trembled uncontrollably, their legs felt like lead, but they still refused to let go of the captain, not until someone else could take their place. Through the broken windshield, the first firefighter's helmet appeared. They had been briefed: windshield failure, captain partially outside, possible fatal injuries, but nothing could prepare them for what they actually saw: the captain's limp body hanging outside the aircraft, his uniform frozen stiff, his skin pale from the freezing air, his headset long gone. It looked impossible that anyone could survive what he had been through. They moved fast. A team of rescuers climbed onto a platform at the nose of the aircraft, anchoring themselves with rope. The co-pilot shouted hoarsely through the wind, pointing, explaining with gestures since his voice was all but gone. The rescuers worked in brutal, freezing gusts to ease the captain's body back inside. For the flight attendants, that moment felt like eternity. Their arms finally gave out as trained hands replaced their desperate grip. The captain's body slid back through the cockpit opening, limp but not lifeless. Inside the cockpit, the air felt strange. Quiet wasn't the right word. The wind still howled through the opening, but something had shifted. The weight, the strain, the endless battle to keep him alive was now in someone else's hands. The co-pilot leaned back, chest heaving, tears mixing with the cold air on his cheeks without him even noticing. He hadn't cried during the crisis. He didn't have time. But now, in that moment between survival and aftermath, everything inside him finally caught up. The flight attendants collapsed back against the walls of the cockpit floor, their arms numb and useless, their faces streaked with windburn and exhaustion. One of them whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe just a single breath of relief. Their hands were trembling too much to even wipe their faces. They looked at the captain's body as paramedics surrounded him, their movements fast but careful. No one spoke loudly. No one dared break that fragile, suspended silence. As the paramedics began their work, oxygen masks were placed on the captain. His pulse was faint, his body temperature dangerously low, but he was breathing. Against every probability, against everything physics and logic would have predicted, he had survived being pinned outside a flying aircraft at 17,000 feet. They stabilized him as best they could in the cramped cockpit before lifting him out onto a stretcher, the red and blue lights from the emergency vehicles casting eerie shadows over everything. In the cabin, when word began to spread that the captain was alive, the atmosphere changed again. People started to cry for real this time. Some clapped weakly. Others simply sat there, gripping the hands of the people next to them, their faces wet with tears. A few whispered "thank you" into the air, to no one and to everyone at the same time. The co-pilot remained in his seat, shaking. When one of the firefighters climbed inside to check on him, he barely registered the words. His body was still in survival mode, running on the last thin thread of adrenaline. But somewhere deep in his mind, he knew the truth. He had landed that plane alone. He had fought the storm, the freezing wind, the chaos. He had held on to his captain for dear life. And somehow they had all made it down. Outside, the sirens wailed softer now as the captain was rushed to an ambulance. The crew was escorted down the steps, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale and red from the cold. Passengers were let out carefully, many still clutching their belongings like talismans. Some stopped and looked back at the aircraft, the silent, battered machine that had carried them through a nightmare and brought them home. As the co-pilot stepped onto the tarmac, the cold air hit him again, but this time, it wasn't the same. It wasn't a monster trying to rip him apart. It was just air. The runway lights shimmered against the dark sky, the emergency crews moved like a quiet army, and somewhere behind the flashing lights, the captain was being treated. The co-pilot lowered his head, took a slow, shaking breath, and whispered to himself, "We didn't let go." That night would be remembered not as just another air disaster, but as the night humanity refused to surrender to the sky. A crew held on. A man lived. And a story was born of courage, grit, and the will to fight for each other even when the storm tries to tear everything away. The ambulance lights flashed against the skin of the aircraft, red and white streaks reflecting off the metal fuselage that had been ripped open by the sky. The night air was cold, damp, and strangely quiet compared to the roaring storm inside British Airways Flight 5390 just minutes earlier. The plane now sat at the far end of Southampton Airport, surrounded by a swarm of fire trucks, emergency vehicles, and medics moving with a rehearsed but tense precision. For the passengers, it was over. For the crew, it was only sinking in now what they had survived. And for the co-pilot, the silence felt louder than the hurricane of wind that had nearly taken everything from him. His hands, still trembling, were stained with streaks of blood, not from violence but from the captain's belt that had torn through his skin during the fight. His muscles burned like they were made of steel pulled too tight. The adrenaline that had kept him alive was fading now, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion. He sat there in the captain's seat, staring at the broken frame of the windshield. Cold night air still whipped in through the jagged opening, but it felt softer now, weaker, like the monster that had tried to tear them apart had finally let go. The co-pilot leaned forward, resting his forehead against his hand, and for the first time since the bang, he allowed himself to breathe. Not just to inhale, but to breathe. The flight attendants who had anchored the captain's body were being helped out of the cockpit by rescue personnel. They could barely walk. Their arms were stiff, hands locked from holding on so long. One of them had deep bruises on her forearms. Another's hair was matted to her face, soaked and frozen by the slipstream. They had been ordinary crew members a few hours ago. Now, they looked like people who had gone to war and somehow returned. The emergency team wrapped them in thick blankets, their shivering bodies slowly thawing. One of them kept whispering, "We didn't let go. We didn't let go," like a broken prayer. Out on the tarmac, the captain was being rushed into the ambulance. His face was pale and bruised, lips cracked from the freezing air, his clothes stiff from the storm. But there was a pulse. A weak, fragile pulse, but it was there. The paramedics worked quickly, their faces focused, professional, but even they couldn't hide the flicker of disbelief in their eyes. A man had survived being pinned outside a flying aircraft for nearly 20 minutes. They loaded him carefully, voices low, movements precise, and when the ambulance doors closed, the siren began its slow wail toward the hospital. Inside the terminal, passengers were being guided to a holding area. Many were still in shock, moving as if they were sleepwalking. The panic that had filled the cabin during the descent had now turned into a strange, fragile calm. Some cried softly. Others sat wrapped in foil blankets, staring down at their hands. A woman clutched the cross around her neck. A man held his child so tightly the little boy buried his face in his chest. They had all experienced the same storm, the same silent countdown to an ending that, against all odds, never came. Reporters had already gathered outside the airport, the world beginning to learn about what had happened in the sky that evening. But none of the passengers or crew cared about headlines. They just wanted to feel ground beneath their feet again. The co-pilot finally climbed down the metal stairs of the plane. The cold air bit at his face, but compared to the icy howling wind at altitude, it felt almost gentle. Rescue workers met him halfway down, their voices soft, their eyes wide with quiet respect. This wasn't a typical emergency landing. Everyone knew it. This was survival carved out of the jaws of the impossible. As he stepped onto the tarmac, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. The paramedics rushed forward, but he waved them off weakly. He wanted to walk. His boots touched the ground, and for the first time since the explosion of the windshield, he felt the earth steady beneath him. The flight attendants followed close behind, each supported by a firefighter. Their eyes were glassy, exhausted, but they were standing. And that was everything. In the background, mechanics and investigators were already moving toward the aircraft. They studied the torn-out windshield, the frame where bolts had sheared clean, the jagged edges that told the story of how fragile something so powerful could be. No one said it out loud yet, but they all knew. Something as small as the wrong bolts in the wrong place had nearly cost an entire plane full of lives. Hours later, in a small, quiet hospital room, the captain lay under heavy blankets with oxygen lines running across his face. His body temperature was low, his face covered in bruises and frostbite, but he was alive. Doctors stood around him, exchanging looks that carried both shock and respect. He shouldn't have made it. By every logical calculation, the force of the slipstream should have killed him within minutes. But he had made it back, because a crew refused to let him go. The co-pilot sat nearby, still wrapped in a blanket, his hands bandaged, his eyes unfocused but sharp with memory. He could still feel the wind in his ears, the scream of it. He could still see the captain's limp body hanging against the sky. And he could still hear the moment the wheels slammed against the runway. Every second of that flight was burned into him now. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a quiet, unshakable pride. Not the kind built on medals or ceremony. The kind forged in the middle of a storm, when no one was watching, and everything depends on whether you give up or keep holding on. In the following days, the investigation would reveal exactly what went wrong. A windshield replacement had been done with incorrect bolts, just a fraction too small, and under the pressure at cruising altitude, it had given way like a thread snapping. It was a mechanical failure that could have doomed them all. But the story that echoed across the world wasn't just about bolts or pressure differentials. It was about people. A co-pilot who flew through chaos. Flight attendants who held on with frozen hands. A captain who endured the unendurable, and a cabin full of passengers who lived to tell the tale because a handful of people refused to let go. As dawn broke the next morning, the image of the damaged aircraft on the tarmac spread across television screens and newspapers everywhere. But for those who had been on board, it wasn't just a headline. It was the night they had stared into the storm and walked out alive. The co-pilot, sitting outside the hospital room, looked through the window as the sun crept over the horizon. His hands still ached. His chest still carried the weight of what happened. But he knew one thing with certainty. No one on that flight would ever forget what it meant to fight for someone's life at 17,000 feet. And somewhere deep down, even if no one else saw it, he whispered to himself the words that had carried them through the longest night of their lives: "We didn't let go." He closed his eyes for the first time since the incident, the storm finally silent, the ground steady beneath him.